What is more dangerous, never being seen at all, or finally being seen by the whole world at the exact moment your past comes back to destroy the future? That is where Karla Sofía Gascón's story begins. Not in triumph, not in scandal, but in the brutal distance between the two. Because for years, Karla lived the kind of career most global audiences barely notice. She worked, survived, and kept moving through an industry that was not built to make someone like her easy to understand. Long before Hollywood turned her into a headline, she had already spent years becoming herself in a world that rarely rewards that honestly. And maybe that is why her rise hit so hard. It did not feel like the arrival of a manufactured star. It felt like delayed recognition, the world catching up to a woman who had already paid dearly for visibility. Then came the role that changed everything. One performance, one film, one season of attention powerful enough to redraw her life. With Emilia Pérez, Karla did not simply become more famous, she became symbolically important. Suddenly, she was no longer just an actress from Spain with a long road behind her. She was being introduced as a milestone, a first, a breakthrough, a woman carrying something larger than her own performance on her back. That kind of spotlight can look beautiful from a distance. Up close, it is terrifying. Because once the world decides you represent progress, it stops watching you like a person. It starts watching you like proof. And proof is fragile. That is what makes this story so unsettling. Karla's rise should have felt like a victory people knew how to celebrate. A woman who had fought to exist on her own terms was now being recognized on one of cinema's biggest stages. Cannes, awards buzz, Oscar history. The language surrounding her grew larger by the week, and so did the pressure. But every historic ascent carries a hidden cruelty. The higher the moment rises, the more catastrophic it feels when something dark appears underneath it. And with Karla, the darkness did not come from failure. It came from the past. That is the part that makes the story feel unbearable in retrospect. She had spent years moving toward visibility, only to discover that visibility is not mercy. It is exposure. The spotlight does not only illuminate what you want the world to see, it digs, it reopens. It drags forgotten versions of you into the present and demands an explanation right when you are least able to survive one. So the question becomes, when someone reaches a historic moment, what does the public really want from them? Perfection, redemption, or simply a reason to turn celebration into punishment? That tension was already sitting quietly underneath Karla's breakthrough, even before everything exploded. Because the world is often comfortable applauding a symbol, but much less comfortable facing the mess of a real human being. And Karla was never going to enter history as a neat, polished symbol. She carried too much life for that, too much contradiction, too much time spent outside the safe version of fame people prefer. Maybe that is why her story feels so immediate, because it is not only about one actress, one film, or one controversy. It is about what happens when a person finally reaches the threshold of history and learns that history is not always a welcome. Sometimes it is a trial. Sometimes it is a stage built too quickly, under lights too harsh, for a human being to stand on without shaking. And Karla Sofía Gascón was about to find out just how fast a breakthrough can turn into a battlefield. The rise should have been simple. That is what makes it so haunting. A performance breaks through. A woman who spent years living outside the center of the frame finally steps into it. Critics notice, festivals notice, awards conversations begin. The industry starts using that special kind of language it saves for moments that feel larger than entertainment, historic, overdue, important. And for a brief moment, it all looks almost clean, as if talent and timing had finally aligned for Karla Sofía Gascón in the way they are always supposed to in the stories people like telling about cinema. But real breakthroughs are never that clean, not when the person at the center of them has to carry more than just a role. With Emilia Pérez, Karla did not just enter the awards conversation, she entered history through it. Suddenly, she was no longer being discussed only as an actress. She was being framed as a milestone, a first, a symbol, a woman whose presence on that stage meant something beyond performance. That kind of recognition sounds like triumph, and maybe part of it was. But it was also pressure disguised as celebration, because once the world decides you represent progress, it stops asking only whether you were good. It starts asking whether you are worthy of what your image now means to other people, and that is a brutal way to rise, because symbols are loved differently than people are. A person can be contradictory, wounded, unfinished. A symbol is expected to arrive purified, easy to praise, easy to defend. Easy to place inside a headline that makes everyone feel morally clear. But Karla's story was never going to be that neat. She had taken too long to get here, lived too much to fit cleanly inside a polished narrative. What the public was celebrating was real, but so was the danger underneath it. The higher she rose, the less room there was for complexity. The more historic the moment became, the more catastrophic it would feel if anything disrupted it. And still, the rise kept accelerating. Cannes turned the performance into international heat. The award circuit turned that heat into inevitability. Then came the language of breakthrough in its most intense form, not just acclaim, but significance. Karla was being watched with the kind of gaze that can change a life in weeks. And maybe that was the most fragile thing about the whole moment. It was moving too fast, too beautifully, too publicly. The world was not simply discovering her, it was constructing meaning around her in real time. And meaning built that quickly is always unstable. So the real question was never just whether Karla Sofía Gascón had given a performance worthy of history. It was whether anyone can survive becoming history while still being treated like a human being. Because that is the hidden cruelty of moments like this. The applause grows, the headlines sharpen, the symbolism expands. And somewhere inside all of it, the person at the center starts disappearing. Not erased, elevated, which can be even more dangerous. And Karla was about to learn that the world does not always know how to celebrate a breakthrough without immediately turning it into a test. And then the past arrived with perfect timing. Not years earlier, when it might have damaged a career quietly. Not years later, when the mythology might have been strong enough to survive it. But right there, at the exact moment Karla Sofía Gascón was turning from acclaimed actress into historical symbol. That is what made the fallout so violent. Because scandals do not land with equal force, they land according to altitude. And Karla was suddenly very high. She was not just having a good year. She was standing inside a moment the industry wanted to frame as meaningful, progressive, almost redemptive. The narrative was already written: breakthrough, history, recognition, a barrier shattered in public. Then the old posts resurfaced, and within hours the entire emotional temperature changed. The celebration did not fade, it curdled, and that is always worse, because when the public turns against an ordinary celebrity, it usually attacks fame. But when it turns against someone who has just been lifted into symbolic importance, it attacks the symbol itself. Suddenly, the conversation was no longer only about Karla's performance, or even Karla as a person. It became about contradiction. About whether someone who had just been embraced as a historic figure could survive the exposure of language from the past that felt ugly, inflammatory, impossible to explain away cleanly. That is when a career crisis becomes something larger and darker. Not simply, what did she say, but what does this do to what she now represents? Can a milestone still be a milestone if the person attached to it becomes controversial? Can a breakthrough remain meaningful when the face of it is no longer easy to defend? Those were the questions hanging over everything. And maybe that is why the reaction felt so merciless. The world was not only disappointed, it was offended by the timing. There is something especially brutal about watching a person reach the edge of history, then be dragged backward by a version of themselves the public suddenly finds unbearable. It creates a kind of whiplash that modern media knows how to amplify perfectly. One day, the language is iconic, important, first. The next, it is offensive, damaging, indefensible. The rise and the rupture happen so close together that the audience barely has time to process either one honestly. Karla apologized. She said she was sorry. She stepped back, and the silence that followed became its own kind of narrative. Was it strategy, shame, protection, damage control? At that point, it almost did not matter. Once the scandal had reached that scale, every move looked guilty to someone and insufficient to someone else. That is the trap. The internet does not ask for remorse so it can heal. It asks for remorse so it can keep judging the shape of it. And that is what made this chapter so painful to watch, because the woman at the center of the storm was now trapped between two impossible versions of herself. On one side stood the figure the award season had elevated, the history-making actress, the milestone, the symbol of visibility. On the other stood the person the scandal had suddenly exposed to relentless scrutiny, flawed, contested, difficult, politically explosive, impossible to reduce to a clean narrative anymore. The public wanted to know which one was real, but that question was already wrong. Both were real. And that was the problem. People are comfortable celebrating symbols. They are far less comfortable when those symbols reveal the mess of being human. Karla's controversy did not just threaten her awards campaign, it threatened the emotional simplicity of the story surrounding her. It forced the world to confront a fact it usually hates. History is rarely made by perfect people, and when imperfect people become historic too quickly, the culture often panics. So this was no longer just a scandal, it was a collision between progress and punishment, between recognition and rejection, between the world's hunger to create icons and its equal hunger to tear them apart the moment they become inconvenient. And for Karla Sofía Gascón, that was the moment the breakthrough stopped feeling like a victory. It started feeling like a trial. What makes Karla Sofía Gascón's story so difficult to look away from is not just the scandal, it is the timing of the wound. Because there are people who spend their whole lives trying to enter history, only to discover that history does not arrive as protection. It arrives as pressure. And in Karla's case, that pressure became unbearable almost instantly. She had just crossed into a space no openly trans actress had crossed before in the Oscar race, with Emilia Pérez turning her into both a breakout star and a cultural symbol. Then the controversy around old posts changed the mood so violently that the same moment that should have secured her legacy suddenly threatened to define it in an entirely different way. That is what makes the ending so uncomfortable, because this is not a clean story about triumph. But it is not a clean story about erasure either. Karla apologized. She stepped back. She said she would stay silent so she would not damage the film further. Yet none of that restored simplicity, because simplicity was already gone. Once the public had seen both versions of her at once, the history-making figure and the deeply controversial person, there was no way to put either one back in the dark. So what remains? Not a perfect icon, not a total collapse, something messier than both. What remains is a woman who still changed something, even if the world no longer knows how comfortably to celebrate that change. And maybe that is the final tension at the center of her story. Can a moment still matter if the person inside it becomes hard to defend? Can a breakthrough remain historic when admiration curdles into argument? Karla Sofía Gascón forces that question in a way very few public figures ever do, because her rise and her rupture happened almost at the same speed. Maybe that is the real ending. Not that she was destroyed, not that she was redeemed, but that she became impossible to simplify. And perhaps that is why her story lingers. It exposes something modern celebrity culture hates admitting. People want symbols, but history is usually carried by human beings too flawed to remain symbols for long. Karla reached the threshold of cinematic history and stayed there just long enough for the world to see both her significance and her contradictions in the same frame. And once that happens, a person is no longer just famous. They become a debate no one knows how to finish.